tonight. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to say a few words and to introduce a few lines of thought about this question of infrastructure. It's a word that gets used widely in all of the European languages. It's a word that gets used incredibly widely in the sense of everyday speech, but it's a word that's rarely defined. It's a word that is often absent in terms of clinical definition. So the title of what I have to say is The Politics of Digital Infrastructure in Cities, okay? Both in an urban context, a city of 4 or 5 million people like Berlin, but in a society where the digital is pervading everything, where the digital is mediating every micro aspect of every dimension of our lives. And this is a transformation that has come on in a profoundly rapid and unpredictable and sometimes bewildering way. So let's kick off with the obvious point that cities are and cities always have been the sort of key hubs of infrastructural society. We're going right back to the origins of cities. They are always the hubs that concentrate infrastructure that become possible through infrastructure. And in the latest transformations of digitized infrastructure and digital infrastructure, we're just seeing the latest manifestation of a very old process. And in a way, infrastructures historically, in terms of modern cities, industrial cities, have been a way of making what geographers call nature into culture. They bring all of the resources, all of the water, energy and food and communications into cities from all of the distant hinterlands that serve cities. Often that's very contested and so on. And they move all of the things out of cities that we want to leave. We want to remove through the wastes and outputs of the city. These can be in gas form, through pollution, they can be in water form, they can be in produced form, all of the products and services. So digital media are interfacing with big questions about who we are as people. Our very bodies are caught in these webs of infrastructure. And these are webs of infrastructure that are often invisible. Without the infrastructure, we simply can't live. That's the bottom line. If you imagine Berlin without the vast array of food infrastructures, logistics infrastructures, energy, water, waste, as well as digital media, which allows all the rest to function these days, we would be in a state of massive crisis. You try living without electricity for a week, and you start to realize that the always-on, switched-on infrastructural city is always linked to those flows. Okay, that raises a few questions that I'm going to concentrate on. Firstly, I want us to ask the question, what infrastructure actually is? And as I said before, there's a startling lack of really good social science literature which really tries to define this word we use so readily. Secondly, I want us to look at the question of digitization and how does the digitization not only of the city, but of all the other infrastructures of the city, raise questions about equality and social exclusion. And thirdly, I want to look at the question of the smart city. This is a language and a paradigm that's really powerful in terms of thinking through how digital technology can be harnessed to a city's future. Very contested, and I want to look into some of those ideas and perhaps to criticize them. And finally, I want to explore some of the work that Toby was discussing, which is to look a little bit at how we understand more about infrastructures when they're taken away. Somehow you learn a lot more about a power grid or an internet system if it's actually removed from you. There's a paradox there that's always very interesting, I think. In terms of defining infrastructure, I think the best academic source is a wonderful anthropologist called Susan Lee Starr, who's sadly no longer with us, but she wrote this really powerful work where she really went into the fine grain of the things we name as infrastructure, the things we actually encompass within that term. And there are a lot of technical questions here. She talks about them offering spatial and temporal reach, so connecting other times and places to where you are now. She talks about the fact that you have to learn how to use infrastructure, whether it be turning a tap on as a child, learning how to use toilets, cars, electricity plugs, and so on. And obviously the vast and complex world of learning how to use digital media, which seems to be reinvented every 5 minutes, for a 53-year-old man like me anyway, right? It's linked to conventions of practice. So there are all sorts of cultures and norms about how we use these vast arrays of technologies. It embodies standards. Think about the different plugs you have to carry around the world because of the inherited technologies of different national power systems. It's built in what they call sunk capital. Sorry, this sounds like a dry economics lecture. It will make sense later on. So it's sunk into the world around us to allow us to move all sorts of things around. It's fixed in what she calls modular increments, so continually added to. You don't build an entire global power system all at once. You don't build an entire global airport system all at once. And it's complicated, as people in Berlin know, with the Schönefeld story. It's embedded, so infrastructure gets sunk into all the other aspects of life. And that word is interesting, because as I say, it's often forgotten about once it's there. It's often forgotten about until it doesn't work. And finally, it's transparent, which means that when you start a car, you don't need to think about all of the different things that are going on to allow you to drive the car. As when you get on a train, it's not a long, complex process. You're just getting on the train and going. There is a ninth feature, which I will return to. But this definition of infrastructure, I think, helps us to be quite precise about what digitization does to infrastructure. Because it builds on the history of how electricity, of how communication systems like telegraph and telephone systems, how water systems, metro, subway, U-Bahn, of how all of the other grids that built modern cities like Berlin came to be in place. They came to be in place, and once all those systems were built, we tended to do what sociologists call black box the technology. What that means is you just treat it as something to use. You don't go into all of the details inside each system each time you use it. So when infrastructures work best, they're noticed least of all. That's the quote from a colleague, David Perry. This is an image of when infrastructures were not working well. This is an image from Manhattan in 1884, when they were just starting to string telephone lines around the city. Each one of those lines is a telephone line. It was chaos. This was before the telephones became black boxed. Once the blizzards brought all of these things down, they were put underground. And then you could just pick up the phone and it would be connected, and that was the end of the story. Electricity was very much at the center of these transformations, and this city was the electrical metropolis par excellence. In the 1920s, especially in the Weimar period, there was a huge excitement that Berlin's massive growth into the industrial superpower, quite late in the day compared to Britain and France, was fueled by a huge advanced electrical infrastructure that was very much the focus of conversation. Who now thinks of electricity as the cutting edge of infrastructure? But in 1930s, it very much was. So what about digitalization, okay? What about how IT coming into the scene changes places, changes people, and changes cities? Well, there was a long tradition, particularly in North America, of seeing it in a very sort of, I think, quite a naive way. The assumption, particularly between the 1960s and the 1980s, was that because you could move more and more information over faster and faster communications grids, culminating in optic fibers and global satellite networks and so on, cities would somehow cease to exist. Okay, we would somehow all be able to do anything, anywhere. And I find this particularly fascinating because I was hearing about the location of the Humboldt-Institute today and how it being close to the Parliament buildings and to the centre of Berlin was absolutely pivotal to its success. Historically, a lot of people like Marshall McLuhan thought the city was anachronistic, it was old-fashioned, it was going to be literally disinvented as people could do all of their communication remotely from wherever they wanted to live. So if you look at some of these quotes, Martin Pawley, an architect, says, in urban terms, once time has become instantaneous, you can send anything, anywhere, anytime, at light speed, space becomes unnecessary. There's almost a sense that we're going to inhabit cyberspace. And cyberspace was very much seen as a separate world in the 80s and the 90s. Marshall McLuhan says the city is a form of major dimensions, and this is in 1964, must inevitably dissolve like the fading shot in a movie. So why has that not come to pass? We are now living in the most urbanized age in the history of our world, and it's the most digitized age in the history of our world. My argument is that's not a surprise. My argument is that digital media, digital technologies facilitate urbanization and relate really closely and subtly to the fact that we're all here today. If media was so fantastic, why would you all come here to see a face-to-face exposition of an argument? You know, place still matters, and arguably matters as much as ever, despite the incredible growth of digital technologies. Sorry, there's a bit of text in this one, but I think it's worth reading. The response to people who saw cyberspace as a separate world that we would somehow start inhabiting in a sort of VR sense was most powerfully expressed by two media theorists in the United States, J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin. And they said, rather than substitute for the city, or the body, or the book, or the street, or the newspaper, or the building, all of these technologies were actually what they called remediating those things. So let me just go through this quote, and you might get a sense what they mean by that. It's really quite subtle. So they say, cyberspace is very much part of our contemporary world. It is made through these remediations. So as a digital network, it remediates electric communications, so telephone, telegraph, and so on. It remediates painting, film, and television. So none of those have gone away. They've had to be digitized and are now organized and consumed and produced through digital media, which has profound implications. So these new media, and this is going back to 1990s, this was deemed to be quite a revelation, given this weight of debate from North America that somehow cities were going out of fashion. What the argument is that far from going out of fashion, these digital media reanimate and reorganize places in ways that are so important and so hard to understand because they're so political and yet so hidden. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So let's just take some examples. Just think, I would say, of this humble device in your pocket. Think how the smartphone has remediated the camera, the video camera, the map, cartography, computer databases, the telephone, rather obviously, global navigation systems, and so on and so forth, global retail and shopping and logistics systems. Because that phone is a portal into an unknowably complex set of infrastructures that straddle the world. Every time you use the GPS on that system, you are connecting to 24 geostationary satellites owned by the US Air Force that are the same things used to drop bombs on targets in Afghanistan. Okay. Behind this front end is this vast backstage, the backstage of global information infrastructure. Think of the book. Everyone was saying the book is dead. The book is doomed. We're all going to have Kindles and e-readers and so on. But it's not the case. Books are now organized and consumed in all sorts of different ways, but the physical artifact has almost an extra pull. Yes, bookstores are dying, but there's as many books printed as ever. Think about the body. Think about how digital bodies are being reorganized and interfaced with all sorts of technologies through sort of cyborg-type transformations. Think of EasyJet and how the front end of the cheap airline system, with you doing all the work rather than a travel agent, has completely transformed global airline flows. We don't sit all at home in our little VR caves doing virtual tourism. We're traveling more and more around the world between cities, which has huge impacts for big tourist cities like Berlin because of the Airbnb boom, which is another platform which reorganizes urban space and so on. Think about streets, think about global spaces, think about the globe, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that the best way of us thinking about these subtle transformations in the relationship between digital media and place and bodies and cities is this concept of remediation, how the old is remediated into all sorts of new dynamics, which has really profound implications because of the ease of connecting through platforms. I'll give you one example. The Guardian, traditionally the left-leaning newspaper in the UK, only read by physically printing the actual paper, transporting it across the UK, a very UK-centered audience, that physical logistics. Now it's the biggest left-leaning newspaper in North America. Okay? It's hardly printed at all, and that print run is threatened. Some newspapers are not doing it at all, but it doesn't go out of business. It reorganizes itself as a platform for digital content that's globally accessible. But let's not forget that internet infrastructure is physical too. Too much of that 80s and 90s stuff was suggesting that somehow the virtual, the cyber, was just going to arrive as if by magic everywhere and anytime. This is profoundly geographical. It exists in some places and not in others. And cities generally have a huge advantage because of the way they concentrate the best digital communications infrastructure. I have two teenage sons, 18 and 19. They go into a cold sweat if they don't have broadband digital media access saturating their lives. And they basically don't get that in rural England. And they genuinely have psychological disturbances. Okay. But it's not just about the actual cables and satellites of the global internet system and its associated financial media and so on systems. There's a huge array of other infrastructures that sustain that. Think of the electricity system that drives internet. It consumes vast amounts of energy. Think of, does anyone know what this is? This is the internet, by the way. Well, it's part of the internet, this thing we call the internet. Any suggestions? This is a cooling complex of one of the hundreds of Google server farms that are being located all around the world near cheap energy. They're increasingly moving to higher latitudes. Global warming is forcing them to go further and further north. So at some stage, there's going to be vast amounts of server farms cooled by these enormous cooling systems because of the heat they generate, moving higher and higher in the global latitudes. It's a fascinating and poorly discovered process. When do you ever think of this when people talk about the internet? This is the backstage, but it's profoundly important materially and environmentally. So that's the question of what infrastructure is, okay? I want to move now on to the question of smart cities. It's a word that's everywhere, just as digital cities were, or virtual communities were 20 years ago, or cyberspace perhaps 25, 30 years ago, or wired cities in the 1960s. There's a very long history to the idea of political and governance communities, real estate organizations, place marketing organizations, trying to sell their cities by making them look high-tech. Remember Berlin with its electricity infrastructures in the 1920s and 30s? The last 30 or 40 years, it's been profoundly about who's more digital and more futuristic, as we were hearing with Toby. And the smart city rhetoric is powerful at the moment. It's coming out of the IT corporations, it's coming out of the cities themselves and the real estate organizations and so on. And it builds on a whole set of debates that surround pervasive and ubiquitous computing and the way it's permeated everyday life in terms of bodies, buildings, cities, spaces and infrastructures. On the back of the Internet of Things, ubiquitous computing, social media, the massive growth of Google Earth and based cartography and navigation systems. And it's very much a sort of cybernetic idea that this time, despite all of the failures with previous information systems in cities, we will have perfect information. We will have perfect optimization. We will be able to control all of the complex systems that connect cities in terms of nature, ecology, infrastructure. And this is the image that often dominates smart cities debates, the well-known and incredibly well-photographed control room in Rio that was put together on the back of the huge investment in the Olympic and World Cup programs. IBM, one amongst many big IT corporations, trying to get into what they call the urban operating system world, trying to colonize all of the sort of backstage of cities in terms of their data, their software, their operating systems. IBM described the problem as thus: today's cities are based on separate domains, right, with no real ability to be managed as an entire entity. So too fractured, too disparate, too confusing. City managers have no single place to get the real-time status. They want the updates to the minute, cybernetic style, or historical reports. Daily operations generate vast amounts of data from many different sources, but cities lack the ability to extract meaningful information. It's sort of the fog of war, the chaos of situated life in a big urban administration. Not surprisingly, the likes of IBM say they have the solution. The solution is the smart city. It's their smart city. It's not Cisco's or Hitachi's or whoever else. And it's this sort of thing, which is a very old idea. If anyone's been done any research on the history of cybernetics, that was a very urban idea post-1940s. A lot of urban management, urban governance techniques in the States were bringing in military notions about cybernetic control of highway planning and housing planning and welfare systems and so on. And this is an example of, say, the mundane world of traffic regulations, how you can bring all of those different databases together, make them talk to each other, have this clarity, have this perfect knowledge that's often being discussed. What's very important, I think, given what Toby was saying about this urge to be futuristic, this urge to sell your city as a high-tech hub, as a center of digital innovation and so on, is it's about symbolic power. The symbolic power of the digital, but also the symbolic power of new physical landscapes. And the history of all of these projects is very much to sell the future. William Gibson famously said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? Now, a lot of city agencies and developers are trying to say, we are here, we are the future. Dubai is fantastic at this. Dubai's actually employed futuristic sci-fi script editors and thinkers to say, how can we look like the future? The guy that designed the Burj Khalifa, the tallest tower in Dubai, is actually employed by the biggest skyscraper architects in the world, SOM, in Chicago. And he said he wanted it to look like the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz. Right? So there's a really interesting debate here about how so much of these future cities are being sold and made and rendered through very bad CGI very often to look like a sort of 1950s vision of the future. So we're looking at retrofuturism now to create cities in the future. Very interesting. So we've had classic examples like Songdo in South Korea. Many of these never get built, but they become icons of the imagination, even without their material emergence. We're getting the big architects, the star-architects of this world, like Foster, coming in to do ecological cities in the Gulf for very lucrative fees, I'm sure. These are being sold as green, as being sustainable, as in ways that reduce resource use and do a lot more recycling and so on. This is Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. What's very often lacking is a social component. What's very often lacking are people, which I think is the really interesting question about smart cities. Where do you ever see a human being on these images or on these diagrams? They are often highly elitist and highly technocratic. Perhaps the most troubling example I can find at the moment is an island which is literally being built out of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Lagos in Nigeria, the biggest city in Nigeria, which is effectively a sort of elite apartheid bubble for real estate interests to colonize, away from the chaotic and flood-prone landscapes of the lagoons of Lagos. This is called Eco-Atlantic. Have a look at it on Google Earth. It's pretty startling. What's also been sold are new ways of life. New ways of life. And this is a very dated version of new ways of life. But very often, these are about new interfaces. They're a sort of Google Glass type notion of the future, which is about augmented reality, a new digitized interfaces between you, your body, your senses, and the wider city. So this is a sort of augmented reality notion, very sort of very sci-fi again, drawing on a myriad of dystopian sci-fi films, probably most notably Minority Report, with the whole idea of the city sensing your location, feeding you data through a whole load of sort of database systems that are connecting your historic preferences to your location, and then you become a marketing opportunity. A lot of the smart city rhetoric is actually about how do you harvest data? How do you commercialize data from the massive amount that we're generating all the time through our digital presence and our digital activities? This is perhaps a satirical take on where this might go if we have complete collapse of privacy, we have complete collapse of data regulation. People talking satirically about post-privacy advertising and the ways in which this could completely challenge all sorts of notions of anonymity. And I think this raises all sorts of questions about the history of cities in the modern industrial period, because for many subcultural groups, many people fleeing the conservatism of village life, the city was vastly seductive because of its anonymity, okay? That was a big part of the pull, the sense of being absorbed into the mass. That was also why the city was such a threat, such a constant threat to political elites in terms of revolution and insurrection. So what happens to those traditions of urbanism, urban political mobilization, in a world which is increasingly tracked, monitored, and sensed in a profoundly intense way, which challenges all sorts of questions of anonymity and privacy? Sorry. But there is a more upsetting and worrying aspect of this, and I know that some of the debates in this these lecture series have talked about this, and that's when you organize cities as vast arrays of software, the agency increasingly is the software. There's no way human agency can monitor and organize all of the actions, all of the activities, all of the infrastructural flows in cities. And once the agency is the software itself, the politics of the city increasingly is defined by who writes that software. How does the software differentiate between people in the city? This is what I call the concept of the software-sorted city. And it's going on all the time. It's going on in ways that are often profoundly invisible. I'll give you one example. This is a very early example, which still includes a human in the interface. We're not talking about complete artificial intelligence in this example. If you ring a lot of the call centers, UK, but also elsewhere in the world, your phone number is automatically sensed by the call center management system. And you are actually queued differently depending on your previous behavior as a customer. Okay? So, for example, a very well-off, good consumer will be answered straight away. You will be bypassing the queue. Someone who's a long-term poor payer, poor debtor, poor consumer will be hanging on. So much of this, the politics of what's going on in these smart cities, the worry is, will be orchestrated in ways that are really hard to get at in terms of mobilization, activism, and regulation. This is getting more powerful because of the shift towards smart video technologies. There are video surveillance systems all over the world now. The numbers are staggering, particularly in parts of the UK, actually. Again, that's shifting to automation and what's called video analytics. So rather than having the bored person eating the sandwich, half asleep, trying to monitor the technology, increasingly the video is computerized, digitized, and the software is making decisions about what is a threat and what needs to be protected. Again, totally political. This is one example which worries a lot of people, and I'm sure there are many others. This is an example of a video system that was tried out in Boston about 7 or 8 years ago, where basically the software detected a man getting out of a car and a cyclist. The man getting out of the car was deemed to be under threat. The cyclist was deemed to be the threat. So again, it's a profound sense of somehow the programming of the software shapes the right to the city. But of course, this gets even weirder and even scarier when you start to see entirely automated urban infrastructures. The example which is getting a lot of attention at the moment is the big push by the likes of Uber for entirely driverless vehicles, entirely driverless cars, trucks, buses, and eventually aircraft that will be the great, what they call disruptor, challenging mass transit systems, conventional human-based auto systems. There's a big, big push there. Again, inspired by historical ideas of the future. How many sci-fi films have you seen without automated vehicles or flying cars, right? But here, this is what the Guardian is calling Franken algorithms, because already people are being hit by these vehicles. A woman was killed in March 2018 as a cyclist on the side of the highway when Uber was doing one of its autonomous vehicle tests. The suggestion is that the various sensors in the car linked to the computerized control systems of the car, they use LiDAR and radar and all sorts of different sensors, detected the woman but deemed it to be a non-human. So down at that micro scale, we're seeing a radical intensification of the politics of the smart city. And as I hinted at before, there's another sort of subtext to this, because so much of the new infrastructures coming into cities are ostensibly about making you bike around cities nice in a cool way, or having really useful search engines or what have you, or driving in autonomous vehicles. But the bottom line is that the profit, very often, from these infrastructures is about harvesting data. It's about selling data within very complex marketplaces. And of course, we're seeing the likes of Apple and Google and so on become the platform for such huge swathes of the world's economy that it, again, matters enormously how those platforms develop, how they prioritize different sources of information, different services, different locations within the city. Things that are very often poorly understood, deemed to be proprietary, very badly regulated in terms of nation states and data protection agencies. We're seeing hints of this with the exposures of the Cambridge Analytica crisis and scandal. We're seeing hints of this with some of the exposures about Facebook and some of the others. We see hints of all of this stuff with various cracks in the edifice, but it's very hard to get a sustained understanding of the politics and social effects of how all that data is harvested, sold, and then passed on. You see the implications with the scary way in which ads follow you around, of course. The scary way in which your consumer behavior on one system will migrate strangely around the various other systems that you use. And perhaps a final aspect of this is the efforts, as I said, by a whole load of different companies to try and build new ways of moving goods, new ways of moving people. Already, the Amazon equivalent in Israel, where did that come from? Iceland, that doesn't look like Israel to me, is offering home delivery through the drone. It seems to be the sort of killer idea for so much of the smart city debate. It's a bit like the smart fridge was for the smart home debate about 20 years ago. As long as the fridge can order milk, we will have digital utopia, right? Now it's as long as the burger can be brought to you through the air, we will have digital nirvana. And this is Dara Khosrowshahi's argument. He's the chief of one of the big Uber pushes into the aerial challenge. He says a key to solving urban mobility is to fly burgers, you know. Some strange stuff flies around these debates. But again, massive amounts of R&D. All of our colleagues in aeronautical departments in universities, in IT departments in universities, are all feverishly at work on so much of these events. I think there are 35 sky taxi projects being launched. These are not for flying burgers, these are for flying people. They're very much a response to the congestion of cities, because everybody's congesting into big cities. They're getting very, very hard to move around. Well, why not go into the vertical dimension and exploit new motor technology, new battery technology, and all of the smart city technologies around navigation, and make them autonomous? I think there may be a consumer resistance to strapping yourself in autonomous vehicles, putting your credit card through a slot and just saying, okay, here we go. But it's all about faith and trust. Who knows? Maybe this will take off. But it's a very contested issue that's very much being embraced by those cities whose elites are trying to be the future. So not surprisingly, a lot of these are having their trials in, you guessed it, Dubai. This is one example. Airbus is very active in this world. They've actually bought one of the apps in Sao Paulo, which is one of the only cities with a big helicopter infrastructure for very, very rich people, very, very small numbers of very, very rich people. There is now a sort of Uber-style app for helicopters in Sao Paulo. It's now being bought by Airbus, which is interesting. They're seeing it as a sort of transition to this sort of futuristic sky taxi system, which they really want to have flying around London by 2023. They're talking about, they're already doing urban scenarios for how this might actually work, where are they going to take people to, where are they going to drop people off, and so on. NASA and so many others are saying, how can city airspaces accommodate all these drones? What are the sort of legal challenges, safety challenges, anti-terrorism challenges of having agricultural drones, drones near airports, sky taxi drones, hobbyist drones, security and surveillance drones, and so on. And architects are getting on the scene with a whole load of different futuristic notions for skyports or vertiports, or the sorts of infrastructures that will be stations in the sky. Again, how many sci-fi films have you seen that don't have flying cars and stations in the sky, or cars that can just land on any street directly from anywhere? It's long been the dream of architects and sci-fi filmmakers. But I think perhaps the biggest concern goes back to the question of anonymity, because once you build biometric systems into smart cities, you effectively have a totalitarian regime's fantasy, as far as I can see. You effectively abolish the notion of anonymity completely. And this is not some bad remake of a George Orwell or a Minority Report. This stuff is moving so quickly with deep learning systems and the contemporary face recognition systems that are embedded in our phones these days, our cameras and so on. The Chinese regime, which is profoundly authoritarian, as we've seen with the clampdown on artists and social movements and journalists recently, has pushed the biggest face recognition system in history onto the streets of Chinese cities. And they are very much on to a complete tracking system for the population. They are now able to name and shame jaywalkers remotely. This is not known to any of the people who are caught doing this activity. But they can do that sort of covert tracking through deep learning. Face recognition was always deemed to be a problem because people age, weather changes, people wear hats, and so on. Because this is now a deep learning system, it is always continually learning each time it tracks a face. So it's continually adapting in a profoundly concerning way. And what concerns me is that this seems to overlap quite a lot with notions of security systems coming out of the US military and the US government. This is the cities under siege work that Toby talked about. The smart city idea of continually sensing everything and analyzing and preempting and predicting overlaps completely, it seems to me, with the sort of military idea of how you can secure cities. In the post-9/11 world, the American Homeland Security Department built these systems into particular cities in America. One was called the Oakland Domain Awareness Center, which basically has a lot of the ingredients that we're talking about. It would have video analytics, it would have cameras, sensors, and so on, loads of different types of sensors for perimeter detection and so on. And it was all about sensing the city and anticipating threat through that dream of real-time information. It was actually not backed through a huge protest by local social movements. And had to change dramatically the way it was enforced. And that shows the importance of those social movements in politicizing what's often presented as a technical and rational development. There you go. The debate was, do you want to live in a surveillance police state? Extra evidence of the depth of the data capture from the security agencies is obviously coming out massively through the various leaks from Snowden, from the Pentagon Papers, from all of the different whistleblower events and so on. And the big one was to see the depth of the NSA, the National Security Agency's capture of data around the world. They have an amazing system for capturing and sieving and sensing data using algorithms. Of course, the volumes here are way beyond anything. This was a revelation of their cryptological platform. They call it SIGINT, which stands for Signals Intelligence. A couple of these big platforms are in north of England, where I live, so we're very aware of this. What's powerful is that the big IT companies willingly give all of their data to the NSA. You can see here, likes of Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook. These are actually military PowerPoint slides that were exposed as part of that revelation. It's called the PRISM system. and it's being used to supply data to vast fusion complexes. This stuff gets enough to get us really paranoid, actually, but this is the biggest of the lot. It's a huge fusion complex for bringing all of that harvested data together and trying to understand interconnections with a view to industrial espionage, but also security. This is in Western US. But it's also very domestic. You can also see through the work of Trevor Paglin, who's a very interesting geographer who works on exposing the geographies and the urbanisms of what he calls the dark state in America, the black projects, the secret security agencies, everything from Area 51 to CIA rendition. Trevor's on the case, and he's even found some evidence that some of the optic fiber grids in Germany are being systematically connected to NSA listening systems. I think all of these issues to do with the digitized end of anonymity in cities overlap with some of the complex discussions about the political situation we're facing at the moment in ways that really challenge our traditions in Europe of open, liberal, cosmopolitan cities. I think there's a sense that profound changes are underway in the media landscape. Obviously, post-truth politics in the US, led by Trump, has a huge bearing here. But I think the final point I want to say about the smart city idea is that it's asocial. It's a non-social view of the future. It's an entire technological, technocratic view of the future city, which I think gets the entire logic wrong. What we need are social visions of the future of cities, which start with all of the pressing social, political concerns, environmental concerns. Then, if digital media are part of the solution, that's fine. But they're trying to squeeze every aspect into this more data, more data. Adam Greenfield, who's done some really interesting critical work on smart cities, puts it this way. He says that this is a quote, smart cities tend to be discussed casually as if it were self-evident that all one needed to do to finally solve the city. Remember the IBM quote earlier on? Is to weave sensors into the urban fabric by the million, trawl the relevant social networks for geo-tagged utterances, and apply just the right analytical algorithms to the ever-mounting tally of tetrabytes captured this way. A lot of the smart city labs seem to be full of very, very bright people trying to do stuff just because the data's there, in other words, which I think is getting it entirely wrong. There are some much more interesting and challenging grassroots social activist platforms. There's a long history of those that I haven't got the expertise to go in, which start with the social. They start with human lives in place and then build from there. This is just one example, which is the work of Christian Nold in East London, who's actually started to tag people as they move around East London to see how stressed they are encountering the pollution and the danger of the various vehicles and highways around East London, with a way of mobilizing for environmental and social justice. My final point is to look at infrastructure from the perspective of failure and disruption. If you remember, Susan Leigh Starr, at the start of this talk, had these quite technical definitions of what makes infrastructure. There were 8 of them. I won't go over them again. But the 9th one, I think, is very important. The 9th one is that infrastructure, quote, tends to become visible on breakdown. Because we have this tendency to put all of the systems that keep our lives going in cities into these black boxes, to not see them, even if they're right in front of us. When those systems go, all of a sudden, those infrastructures become visible. It's paradoxical, very paradoxical. And that means that they become more political, because it's hard to make infrastructure political. So much of the debate about infrastructure seems to be technical, engineering, and to a lot of people, boring, okay? Just give you an example of what happens if you take electricity away from a society that depends on it totally. You have all sorts of effects that move around places, that move between places, that move between different infrastructures in ways that we just can't predict until we have the crisis. So you'll have no gas, you'll have no oil, you'll have no road transportation, you won't be able to get money out of your ATM, and so on and so forth. Just taking electricity away. Electricity is very important because you can't really store it, and yet everything depends on it. We are all hostages to plugging in those bloody smartphones every day, or every 2 days if you've got a new model. What these events also expose is what geographers of infrastructure call topological space. The way infrastructures, especially digital ones, connect here and now with very far away places that don't seem to be connected at all. And I'll give you an example. I won't read this, I hope you can see this, but effectively in 2001, in July, there was a fire in a railway tunnel in Baltimore, underneath the downtown, okay? Very prosaic little urban event. All of a sudden, many countries in Africa don't have email access, okay? And you think, what on earth is going on here? Well, what's going on is that the internet is, remember, a physical thing, and it connects some places and not others. And the fibers that connect Africa, very few of them actually, often do via big connections with North America, where the internet was invented. So emails between two countries in Africa will be going perhaps to Washington and then Baltimore back to the country. So a small fire in a tunnel will expose these really complex and hidden and very political geographies. Another example, even more powerful. In 2008, a fishing boat off the coast of Alexandria in the Mediterranean caught more than fish and managed to sever one of the key optic fiber lines of the global internet system. All of a sudden, 75 million people in the Middle East and in India don't have internet access. Again, why? Well, you have to look at infrastructure. The geography of the fibers, the optic fibers that make the internet work predominantly, is very localized. And Alexandria is pivotal. But these failures and these collapses means that when you have a completely digitized society, completely digitized surveillance system, activists have a lot to go at too, because the evidence is always coming out, because that is recorded as well. So whether it be WikiLeaks, the Panama Papers, Snowden, wonderful websites like Cryptome are continually undertaking what's called sous surveillance. Surveillance from the French means from on high. Sous surveillance is from below, where you are challenging those in power because the digital technologies have a very powerful means of capturing what's going on through elite power. And I'll finish with one example that's really powerful. In the Arab Spring, we all saw how social media was being used to sustain challenges to regimes from Egypt, from Tunisia and so on, sometimes with revolutions and so on. In Bahrain, there was another attempted revolution that was prompted by a Google Earth image. Why a Google Earth image? Well, the majority, I always forget whether it's Shia Muslim or Sunni Muslim. Excuse me if I'm offending anybody. The vast majority of the population living in quite squalid cities could see how the elite, who own all of the real estate, were privatizing and extending the beaches of Bahrain. They could see all of these new beaches being manufactured for real estate, hotels and condos and so on, at the same time as distancing them from their own fishing grounds, their own coastlines. So a new means of visibility, albeit using a sort of highly corporate surveillance system, allows all sorts of new means of challenging those in power. And that was the basis for the mobilization. So I hope this hasn't been a too grim and too paranoid sense of the network and the digitization of urban space. What I hope I've given you a flavor of is the subtlety of how everyday encounters between people in places, the things that keep and always will keep cities going, is now so completely mediated in all sorts of ways by a new set of infrastructures. So thanks very much for coming.